Hi, everybody. We're continuing with Huckleberry Finn. Hope you guys are liking it. I know I am. It's exciting. All right, chapter 8. Well, a couple of days have passed, and Jim and I continued to wait on the king and the duke. After a while, the king got bored with just drifting down the river, and he and the duke began to plan their next caper. "The first town we come to," said the duke, "we'll hire a hall and put on a play, maybe something from Shakespeare." The king explained that he didn't know anything about acting, but the duke told him not to worry. So for the next couple of hours, they practiced. It didn't seem much like a play to me, but I knew the duke had some sort of trick up his sleeve. There was a little town about 3 miles down the bend, and after lunch, the duke said he wanted to stop there. Since we were out of coffee, I decided to go along into town also. Jim stayed on the raft and waited for us. When we got to the town, there wasn't anyone stirring around. The streets were empty and dead. We found one old man sunning himself in his backyard, and we asked him where everybody was. He said the whole town had gone to a camp meeting about 2 miles into the woods. The king decided to have a look while the duke and I headed for the printing office. After searching several streets, we finally found it, hidden away in a dusty side street. It was dirty, cluttered up place, covered with ink marks and littered with handbills. The door was unlocked, so the duke just invited himself inside. He told me to go ahead to the camp meeting. He had things to take care of. The camp meeting was crowded, and the sun was awful hot. The king had gotten himself a little platform in one of the tents, and he was preaching his heart out. He was also passing the plate. Last time I looked, he had almost $7. A few hours later, I returned to the printing shop. The duke was standing outside holding a bunch of handbills that he just printed up. The handbills said, "At the courthouse for 3 nights only, the world-famous tragedians, David Garrick and the younger Edmund, the elder in their thrilling tragedy, The King's Camelot?" I don't know what that word is. Or the Royal Nonsuch. Admission 50 cents. In other words, it's some kind of a farce play they're putting on, and they're charging 50 cents. The duke had me post some of the handbills all over town. Then he sent me back to the camp meeting to hand out the rest. Towards evening, I went back to the raft and found the duke and the king already there. Jim was serving them dinner, and they were plotting and planning for the next day. Early the next morning, we returned to town. The duke and the king worked real hard rigging up a stage, a curtain, and a row of candles for footlights. The courthouse looked mighty fancy when they were done. That night, the house was jam full of people. When the place couldn't hold one other person, the duke quit tending the door and went around the back. He got on the stage, stood up in the front of the curtain, and made a little speech. He praised the tragedy and said it was the most thrilling one that ever was. He just went on bragging about the tragedy and about the star, Edmund. Finally, when everyone's expectations were high enough, he rolled up the curtain. The next minute, the king came prancing out on stage on all fours. His naked body was painted with stripes and all sorts of colors. The outfit was wild and kind of funny. The people almost killed themselves laughing. When the king was finished crawling around and making faces, the people roared and clapped and stormed and haw-hawed until he came back and did it all over again. After that, they made him do it another time. Then the Duke let the curtain down, bowed to the people, and said that the great tragedy would be performed only 2 more nights. He asked everyone to tell their friends about it, so that they too would have this wonderful experience. 20 people shouted out, "What? It's over? Is that it?" When the Duke answered yes, everybody stood up and shouted, "Cheat!" They began heading for the stage. But a big, fine-looking man jumped out on a bench and shouted, "Hold on, folks, just a word. We were cheated mighty badly, but we don't want to be the laughingstock of the whole town. I reckon we'll never hear the last of this thing as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quietly and talk this show up and let the rest of the town be taken, just like we were. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Isn't that sensible? We should all go home and advise everybody to come and see this tragedy." The crowd thought this was a good idea, and they all left quietly. Next day, you couldn't hear anything around town except how wonderful that show was. The house was jammed again that night, and the Duke sold this crowd the same way he'd sold the last. When we got back to the raft after the show, we all had supper. Then the Duke and the King made Jim and me back the raft out and float it down the middle of the river. We had to hide it about 2 miles below town. We didn't understand why, but we couldn't question them. The third night, the house was packed again, but it was packed with all the people who had been at the show the night before. I stood at the door with the Duke, and I could see that every man who entered had his pockets bulging. I could smell rotten eggs, cabbages, and all sorts of foul things. The smell was so strong, I had to leave. Well, when the place couldn't hold any more people, the Duke gave a fellow a quarter and told him to watch the door for a minute or two. Then he started for the stage door. I quickly followed him, and when we turned the corner, he whispered, "Walk fast until you get away from this town. Then run for the raft as fast as you can." I did just that, and so did he. We both got to the raft at the same moment. The King was already there. He'd never even gone to town that night. We didn't dare show a light until we were about 10 miles below the village. Then we lit candles and had supper. The King and the Duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they had tricked all these people. "Dummies," cried the Duke. "I knew the first house would keep Mom and let the rest of town get roped in. I also knew they'd try to get us on the third night, figuring it was their turn to get us. Well, it is their turn. Ha! I'd love to know what they're doing with all those rotten vegetables right now. Maybe they've decided to have a picnic." Those cheats took in $465 in 3 nights. Wow. I never saw money hauled in like that before. By and by, when they were asleep and snoring inside the tent, Jim said, "Doesn't it surprise you the way the King and the Duke carry on, Huck?" "No," I answered. "Why not, Huck?" "Well, because it seems to be in their breed. I reckon they're all alike." "But they're nothing like regular crooks," argued Jim. "Well, that's what I'm saying. All kings and dukes are crooks, as far as I can make out." All of Jim's dreams of royalty were shattered. He didn't say anything more. The sound of the river gently hitting the raft was all I heard. Chapter 9. The Shameful Scheme. The next night, we laid up under a little willow growing out in the middle of the river. There were villages along both banks, and the Duke and the King began to lay out plans for working all of them. They wanted to try the none such tragedy again because there was so much money in it. But they figured it wouldn't be safe because the news might have spread by now. Since they couldn't agree on a project, the Duke said he would rest for a day and work his brains for a while. the king decided to drop over to another village without any plan and just trust in Providence to lead him the profitable way. We had all bought store clothes at our last stop. The king put on his and made quite a fuss over them. The king's duds were all black, and he looked mighty fine and starchy in them. But when he had on that white beaver coat, he looked so grand and good, no one would ever suspect that he was just a low-down crook. Jim cleaned up the canoe so the king wouldn't get dirty, and I got my paddle ready. Then we saw a big steamboat laying at the shore about 3 miles above the town. Since the king was so well dressed, he decided it would look better if we arrived at the town on a steamboat rather than in a canoe. So he made me paddle him up the river to meet the steamboat. I didn't have to be convinced to take a steamboat ride. That was a treat for anyone living along the Mississippi. As we paddled upriver close to shore, I spotted a young, innocent-looking country boy sitting on a log and swabbing the sweat off his face. A couple of big carpet bags sat on the riverbank next to him. The king had me steer the canoe towards the boy. "Where are you bound for?" the king called out. "I'm waiting for the steamboat to New Orleans," replied the boy. The king gave him a big smile and invited him into our canoe. Since we were heading for the steamboat, we could take him there too. The young chap thanked the king, then added, "When I first saw you, I said to myself, it's Mr. Wilkes for sure. He came mighty close to getting here on time. You're him, aren't you?" He said, "No, I'm Reverend Alexander Blodgett," lied the king. "But tell me, lad, why did Mr. Wilkes have to get here on time?" The king was becoming curious about this Mr. Wilkes, and he began to pump the boy for all the information he could get. The boy was only too happy to tell all he knew. It seemed that Mr. Wilkes was due to arrive from England. His brother Peter had lived in this little town until his death 2 days ago. Peter hadn't seen his brothers, Harvey and William, since they were children in England. Peter had come to this country years ago with his brother George, who died some time ago. But his other 2 brothers still lived in England. Harvey was a preacher, and the poor unfortunate younger brother William was deaf and dumb. The boy went on and on with the story. It seemed pretty boring to me, but the king was fascinated. You see, Peter Wilkes had left behind a great deal of money. Of course he did. While he knew he was dying, he'd written a letter to his brother Harvey in England, telling him just where the money was hidden and giving him the rights to it. Peter's wife had died years ago and he had no children. All he had in the whole world were his 3 nieces, George's daughters, and his 2 brothers over in England. At this point, I could see the king's mind working up a sweat. He asked the boy all sorts of questions. How old were these 3 nieces? What they look like? What were their names? He inquired about everybody and everything in that blessed town. When he finished questioning the boy, we dropped him off at the steamboat. The king never said anything about going aboard, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the king made me paddle up another mile to a deserted place on the riverbank. Then he and the Duke went ashore. As he left, the king said to me, "Now hustle back and bring the new carpetbags up here and hurry." I knew what he was up to all right, but I never said a word. I did just what he told me to do. When I got back with the bags, the king and Duke were sitting on a log talking about what the young boy had told them. All the while he was talking, he tried to look and talk like an Englishman. He did it pretty well, too. Then he asked the Duke if he could pretend he was deaf and dumb. The Duke said he was a master at that. So then they waited for the next steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon, a big boat came up the river. They hailed it, and we went aboard. They only had to go about 5 miles. This made the captain pretty angry, what with having to stop and all. But the king gave him an extra $1 to soothe his temper. When the people in the village saw the big steamboat, they flocked to the shore. The first thing the king did when he got on the land was to walk up to a group of men and ask, "Excuse me, can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" The men glanced at one another and nodded their heads as if to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them said real gently, "Poor Mr. Wilkes has passed away." Before I could turn around, the king went all to pieces. He fell against one of the men, put his head on the man's shoulder, and cried down his back. Then he turned around, blubbering, and made a lot of idiotic signs with his hands to the Duke. The Duke immediately fell on one of the men and burst out crying too. If they weren't the meanest lot that I ever saw. All right, that is the end of chapter 9. We'll do chapter 10 and 11 tomorrow. Hope you guys are doing well. Stay tuned.